HFY pressed his 6 fingers against the cool metal surface of the observation deck window. Below him, the blue and green planet called Earth spun slowly in the darkness of space. For 6 months, he had watched the humans from this station. They were the newest members of the Galactic Council, barely meeting the technology requirements to join. The Vorthak researcher found humans strange. They were emotional creatures, unlike his own people. The Vorthak had evolved beyond such primitive feelings thousands of years ago. They made decisions based on logic and facts, not on the wild emotional storms that seemed to control human behavior. Today, HFY was studying something the humans called fear. His data showed that humans experienced this emotion regularly. They feared death, failure, pain, and hundreds of other things. To HFY, this seemed like a serious weakness. How could a species function properly when they were constantly afraid? The door to the observation deck opened with a soft hiss. Captain Park Min-jun entered, carrying a data tablet and wearing his usual nervous expression. The human liaison officer had been assigned to work with the various alien researchers on the station. HFY had requested him specifically because Park seemed to show fear more clearly than other humans. "Good morning, HFY," Park said in his careful, polite voice. "I have the reports you requested about human military training." HFY turned from the window. Park's heart rate had increased slightly, and his breathing was faster than normal. These were signs of fear that HFY had learned to recognize. But why was Park afraid? There was no immediate danger. "You are experiencing fear," HFY observed, tilting his elongated head. "What threat do you perceive?" Park shifted uncomfortably and managed a small smile. "I'm just nervous about presenting to the council next week. Public speaking makes me anxious." Anxious. Another form of fear, HFY noted, making mental calculations. This emotion appears to serve no useful purpose. It reduces your efficiency and causes physical discomfort. Why do humans not eliminate such responses? Park set down his tablet and considered the question. "I suppose we can't just turn off our feelings. Fear keeps us alive. In a way. It makes us careful." HFY found this explanation insufficient. Careful behavior can be achieved through logical analysis of risk factors. Emotion is unnecessary. Under 5. Number 5. FTC. Number 5. "Maybe," Park said, "but fear also motivates us. When I'm afraid of failing, I work harder to succeed." This was an interesting perspective that HFY had not considered. He filed it away for further study. The conversation was interrupted by a soft alarm tone that echoed through the station. Both beings looked up at the speakers. "All senior staff report to the command center immediately," came the announcement. "Priority alert from deep space sensors." Park's fear response intensified dramatically. His face went pale, and his hands trembled slightly as he picked up his tablet. "That doesn't sound good," he said. HFY watched with fascination. The human was clearly terrified, yet he was still functioning. In fact, Park seemed more alert and focused than usual. They walked together toward the command center, Park's quick steps matching HFY's longer stride. The command center was filled with beings from various council races. The station commander, a tall Zilithian named Vorth Commander Keksdal, stood before a large holographic display. The display showed a section of deep space at the edge of their galaxy. 6 hours ago, our long-range sensors detected multiple large objects entering our galaxy from dark space, Keksdal announced. The objects are massive, larger than any known ships or natural phenomena. They appear to be moving toward inhabited systems. A murmur went through the assembled beings. HFY felt nothing but curiosity. Park, however, was radiating fear so strongly that HFY could almost feel it himself. The human was studying the display with intense concentration. "How large are we talking?" asked Dr. Vex Thor, a crystalline scientist. Each object is approximately the size of a small moon, Kexdal replied. They appear to be artificial constructs, but they do not match any known technology in our databases. Park raised his hand tentatively. Commander, with respect, I think we should contact Earth's military immediately. Unknown objects of that size could represent a serious threat. 1. Several alien beings made sounds of amusement. Dr. Vex Thor's crystal body chimed softly, which was how his species laughed. Captain Park, your species has barely achieved faster than light travel. What could human military forces possibly contribute to this situation? Zexhai watched Park's face flush red with embarrassment and anger, but the human's fear seemed to be transforming into something else. Determination, perhaps. You might be surprised, Park said quietly. Preparing for threats through fear-based responses, Zexhai added, genuinely curious. Captain Park, explain this behavior. Park looked around the room of advanced alien beings, all of whom seemed calm and logical about the approaching unknowns. When humans are afraid of something, we plan for it. We think about what could go wrong and how to handle it. We prepare for the worst-case scenarios. Inefficient, stated Kexdal. Logical analysis of available data provides superior planning capabilities. Maybe, Park said. But what if the logical analysis is wrong? What if these objects are hostile and more dangerous than we think? What if they have capabilities we can't understand? The room fell silent. Zexhai noticed that several of the other species were beginning to show their own versions of concern. The crystallines were humming at lower frequencies, and the Zilithians' normally bright skin was dimming slightly. I suggest we maintain standard observation protocols, Kexdal said finally. We will monitor the objects and report to the Council. There is no need for panic or hasty actions. As the meeting ended and beings began to leave, Zexhai remained behind with Park. The human was staring at the holographic display, his fear now mixed with something else that Zexhai couldn't identify. You disagree with the commander's assessment, Zexhai observed. Park nodded slowly. My fear tells me this is bigger than anyone wants to admit. These objects. They feel wrong somehow. Feel wrong. Another emotional response. Yes, Park said, turning to look at Zexhai. And right now, I'm going to trust that feeling and start making some calls to Earth. Because if I'm right and everyone else is wrong, fear might be the only thing that saves us all. Zexhai watched Park leave the command center with quick, determined steps. For the first time in his long life, the Vorthok researcher wondered if there might be something valuable about this emotion called fear. Something his logically superior people might have missed in their evolution beyond such primitive responses. Outside the station's windows, the stars continued to shine peacefully, unaware of the darkness approaching from beyond their light. 3 days passed before the true nature of the approaching objects became clear. Zexhai stood in the command center, watching the updated holographic display with growing interest. The objects had been identified through ancient Galactic Council archives. Devourers, Kexdal announced to the assembled staff. Ancient, automated weapons from a dead civilization. According to historical records, they consume entire star systems to fuel their continued operation. The room erupted in discussions among the various species. Zexhai noticed that each race was responding differently to this information. The crystallines were humming in complex harmonic patterns, indicating deep analytical thought. The Zilithians had gathered in small groups, their skin patterns shifting rapidly as they communicated. The few other humans on the station were clustered around Park, speaking in urgent, quiet voices. The Council is implementing standard evacuation protocols, Kexdal continued. Civilian populations will be moved from the outer systems first, then military assets will be repositioned for defensive operations. Zexhai observed Park during this announcement. The human's fear had not decreased over the past 3 days. Instead, it had intensified. But Park seemed to be channeling it into constant activity. He had been working almost non-stop, gathering data, making communication calls to Earth, and creating what he called contingency plans. After the briefing, HFY approached Park. "Captain, your fear response has remained elevated for 72 hours. This seems physiologically dangerous for your species." Park looked up from his data tablet. His eyes red from lack of sleep. "I can't stop thinking about all the things that could go wrong. The Council's evacuation plan is too slow. The defensive positioning assumes these devourers will behave like normal military forces. What if they don't?" "Explain," HFY said, genuinely curious. Park pulled up a holographic display of the evacuation routes. "Look at this. The plan moves civilians through specific jump points in a logical order based on population density. It's efficient and organized. This appears to be optimal planning," HFY noted. "But what if the devourers can predict our logical choices?" Park asked, his voice rising slightly. "What if they position themselves at these obvious escape routes? What if they're not just mindless machines, but actually intelligent predators?" HFY considered this. "You are suggesting that logical planning could be anticipated by an enemy?" "I'm saying that fear makes me think about all the ways our plans could fail," Park said. "And when I think about failure, I try to prepare backup plans for the backup plans." This conversation was interrupted by urgent alarms throughout the station. The command center filled quickly as staff responded to the emergency signal. The main display now showed a star system at the galaxy's edge, where the devourers had made their first attack. The images were disturbing even to HFY's emotionally detached mind. The devourers had completely consumed 3 planets and were draining energy directly from the system's star. Massive mechanical constructs, each the size of a moon, worked with terrifying efficiency to break down matter into raw energy. "Refugee ships are reporting escape from the Vextara system," reported the communications officer. "They confirm complete planetary destruction. Estimated time to reach the next inhabited system: 14 standard days." Around the command center, the various alien species began showing signs of what HFY now recognized as their versions of fear. The crystalline's harmonic humming became discordant and sharp. The Zilithian's skin patterns turned dark and chaotic. Even the normally calm Vorthak delegation began making rapid calculations and requesting priority communications with their homeworld. Only the humans seemed to be responding differently. While Park and the other humans were clearly afraid, they were not becoming paralyzed or confused. Instead, they were becoming more active and focused. "Commander," Park said, approaching Kexdal with a datapad. "I've been analyzing the devourer attack patterns from the refugee reports. I think there's something important we need to consider." Kexdal looked at the human with barely concealed irritation. "Captain Park, the Council's military experts are handling strategic analysis. Your emotional responses are not required for this process." Park's fear spiked, but he pressed forward. "Sir, with respect, the refugees say the devourers anticipated their evacuation routes. They were waiting at the jump points. The logical escape paths became traps. Impossible," Dr. Vexthor stated. "The evacuation protocols are based on optimal efficiency calculations. No enemy could predict mathematical optimization." "Unless they think the same way we do," Park said. "Unless they're logical too." HFY found himself studying the refugee reports more carefully. The escape patterns did suggest that the devourers had positioned themselves at mathematically optimal interception points. His analytical mind began processing this new information. "Captain Park may have identified a significant tactical concern," HFY said slowly. "If the devourers utilize predictive analysis based on logical optimization, then logical strategies may indeed be ineffective." The room turned to look at the Vorthak researcher. It was unusual for HFY to support human reasoning over established council protocols. "You are suggesting we should base military strategy on fear responses?" Kexdal asked. "I am suggesting that fear-based planning considers possibilities that logical analysis might overlook," Zex-Hi replied. Captain Park's concerns about predictable behavior patterns appear to be supported by the evidence. Park stepped forward, his confidence growing despite his obvious fear. I've been working on alternative evacuation routes that don't follow optimal efficiency patterns. They're longer and more resource-intensive, but they're harder to predict. Inefficient resource allocation is not acceptable during crisis management, Kekstal stated firmly. Being dead is less acceptable than being inefficient, Park replied. The bluntness of this statement seemed to shock the alien command staff. Zex-Hi noticed that Park's fear was transforming into something else again. Not anger this time, but a kind of desperate determination. I've also contacted Earth's military command, Park continued. They want to send a support fleet. Several beings in the room made dismissive sounds. Human military capabilities are insufficient for this level of threat, Dr. Vex Thor chimed. Park's expression hardened. Maybe. But Earth's military has been planning for extinction-level scenarios since before we had space travel. We've been afraid of things like this for centuries. We've been preparing for situations where logic and superior technology fail. Zex-Hi felt something strange stirring in his mind. For the first time in his life, he was experiencing something that might be doubt about the superiority of pure logic. Park's fear-driven preparations were beginning to seem less primitive and more practical. What kind of preparations? Zex-Hi asked. Park looked at him gratefully. Asymmetric warfare tactics. Unpredictable attack patterns. Contingencies for fighting enemies with superior technology. We call it planning for impossible scenarios. Planning for impossible scenarios based on fear of impossible outcomes, Zex-Hi said, more to himself than to the room. Yes, Park said simply. Because sometimes the impossible actually happens. As if summoned by his words, another alarm sounded. The display updated to show the Devourers had finished consuming the Vextara system and were moving faster than predicted toward the next inhabited worlds. For the first time in his life, Zex-Hi felt something that might have been the beginning of fear. The Devourers reached the second star system in 8 days instead of 14. Zex-Hi watched the tactical displays with a growing sense of something he had never experienced before. His logical mind told him this was merely an updated calculation of enemy capabilities. But there was something else happening in his consciousness. Something that made his thoughts race and his body feel different. The second system fell even faster than the first. The Galactic Council's defensive forces had positioned themselves according to standard military doctrine, creating logical defensive formations around key strategic points. The Devourers had ignored these formations entirely, striking instead at seemingly random locations that turned out to be critical infrastructure nodes. They're not fighting like military forces, Park said during the emergency briefing. They're fighting like predators who understand their prey. Zex-Hi had been studying the attack patterns continuously for 6 days. His analytical capabilities were being pushed to their limits. Not by the complexity of the data, but by something else. His mind kept generating scenarios and possibilities that had no logical basis. Worst-case situations. Impossible contingencies. Things that his training told him were statistically irrelevant, but that his thoughts couldn't seem to dismiss. The defensive grid held for exactly 4 hours and 17 minutes, reported Commander Yoon Ji-hae, who had arrived with a small human military consultation team. The Devourers adapted to our tactics in real time. Kekstal studied the tactical reports with visible frustration. Our strategies are based on comprehensive analysis of optimal military positioning. These machines should not be able to counter superior tactical planning. But they did, Park said. They're not just smart. They're learning from our logic. Zex-Hi felt his thoughts spiraling into new patterns. What if the Devourers could analyze Vorthak logic as easily as they had analyzed Council military doctrine? What if logical superiority was not actually superior in this situation? These thoughts created sensations in his body that he didn't understand. His breathing was faster. His hearts were beating at an elevated rate. Zex-Hi, Park said, noticing the Vorthak's distress. Are you all right? I am experiencing unusual cognitive patterns, HFY said slowly. My thought processes are generating scenarios that have no logical basis. Park stepped closer, studying HFY's expression with the same intensity he usually reserved for tactical problems. What kind of scenarios? Situations where the devourers reach our current location. Possibilities where all defensive measures fail. Contingencies where. HFY paused, struggling to articulate thoughts that seemed to come from somewhere beyond his rational mind. Where my people's logical superiority becomes a weakness that leads to our destruction. The command center had grown quiet. Other beings were listening to this exchange between the human and the Vorthak researcher. HFY, Park said gently. I think you're experiencing fear. The word hit HFY like a physical force. Fear. The emotion he had been studying in humans for months. The weakness he had dismissed as primitive and counterproductive. He was experiencing it himself. This is highly disturbing, HFY said. His voice was different, less controlled than usual. I cannot process this sensation logically. You're not supposed to process it logically, Park said. Fear isn't logical. It's information from a different part of your mind. It's telling you about dangers that logic might miss. HFY looked around the command center with new perception. The crystalline beings were humming in increasingly frantic patterns. The Zilithians had formed a tight cluster. Their skin patterns showing rapid, chaotic communications. Everyone was trying to solve the devourer problem through their respective logical frameworks, and everyone was failing. The fear tells me that logical analysis is insufficient for this threat, HFY said, his voice getting stronger. It tells me that we are approaching this problem incorrectly. What does it tell you to do? Park asked. HFY closed his eyes and let the strange new sensations guide his thoughts. It tells me to prepare for scenarios that logic says are impossible. It tells me to assume that everything we think we know is wrong. It tells me to, he opened his eyes and looked directly at Park, to listen to you. Park nodded slowly. The human fleet will arrive in 6 hours. We've been planning based on the assumption that conventional tactics will fail. What unconventional tactics? Kexdal demanded. Commander Yoon stepped forward. We've spent the last 3 days analyzing every failure mode we could imagine. Our fleet is equipped for scenarios that our generals called impossibly paranoid preparations. Explain these preparations, HFY said, his fear-enhanced mind suddenly hungry for information that his logical training would have dismissed. We assumed the enemy could predict all logical tactical choices, Yoon said. So we developed random attack patterns generated by quantum probability cascades. We assumed they could analyze our technology, so we built weapons based on obsolete principles they might not expect. We assumed they could intercept our communications, so we developed coordination methods based on human instinct rather than data transmission. Dr. Vex Thor's crystal body rang with disbelief. You are describing military doctrine based on randomness and primitive emotional responses. This is tactically absurd. Maybe, Park said. But tactical absurdity might be exactly what we need against an enemy that can predict tactical logic. HFY felt his fear transforming into something else. Not calm, but a kind of desperate clarity. Captain Park, I wish to work with the human tactical team. Kexdal stared at the Vorthak researcher. HFY, you are one of our most analytically gifted individuals. Your logical capabilities far exceed human cognitive limitations. Yes, HFY said. And that may be precisely why I have been unable to solve this problem. My logical capabilities are a limitation when facing an enemy that can out-logic our logic. Park smiled, and HFY noticed that the human's constant fear had not decreased, but had somehow become a source of energy rather than paralysis. Welcome to thinking like a human, Park said. It's terrifying, but it works. As the two beings began working together on tactical preparations that made no logical sense, HFY realized that his fear was not diminishing his capabilities. Instead, it was expanding them into areas his logic had never been able to explore. He was thinking of possibilities he had never considered, preparing for scenarios he had never imagined. And for the first time in his life, he felt truly ready for the impossible. Outside the station's windows, space looked different now. Not empty and predictable, but full of hidden dangers and unexpected possibilities. The fear that had once seemed like humanity's greatest weakness now felt like a gift that might save them all. The human fleet appeared on sensors exactly when predicted, but everything about their approach defied tactical convention. HFY watched their chaotic, seemingly random formation with his new fear-enhanced perception and realized it was actually brilliant. No logical enemy could predict chaos born from controlled terror. The real battle was about to begin. The human fleet arrived in a formation that hurt HFY's logical mind to observe. Ships scattered randomly through space with no apparent tactical coordination, moving in patterns that seemed to violate every principle of effective military doctrine. Yet his newfound fear told him there was something brilliant about this apparent chaos. Fleet Admiral Lee So-young, commanding human tactical response, came the communication from the lead human vessel, requesting permission to coordinate with Station Tactical Officer. Park stepped forward. "That's me, Admiral. What's your assessment?" "Terrifying," Lee replied without hesitation. "These devourers learn faster than anything we've ever encountered. Our simulation teams have been working non-stop, and every logical strategy we develop gets countered within hours of implementation." HFY listened to this exchange while monitoring the tactical displays. The devourers had just finished consuming their third star system and were moving toward the next target. Their approach patterns had evolved again, incorporating adaptations that countered the most recent Council defensive strategies. "Admiral Lee," HFY said, stepping into the communication range. "I am HFY, Vorthok Tactical Researcher. I have recently begun experiencing fear, and it has provided new analytical capabilities. May I contribute to your planning process?" There was a pause from the human fleet. Then Lee's voice returned with what HFY was learning to recognize as surprised pleasure. "A Vorthak learning fear? That might be exactly what we need. Can you help us think of scenarios that are too terrible to consider logically?" This request would have seemed insane to HFY a week ago. Now, with fear coursing through his consciousness, it made perfect sense. "Yes. My fear suggests that the devourers may be capable of adapting to adaptation itself. They may be learning not just our tactics, but our methods of developing new tactics. That's what we're afraid of too," Lee said. "Which is why we've prepared for meta-tactical scenarios." Park looked confused. "Meta-tactical scenarios? Plans for fighting an enemy that can predict our planning process?" Commander Yoon explained. "We've developed tactical systems that deliberately incorporate human irrationality, emotional decision-making, and fear-based reactive strategies." HFY felt his fear spike as he understood the implications. "You are proposing to use fear itself as a tactical weapon." "Not as a weapon," Lee corrected. "As a shield. Fear makes us unpredictable in ways that logic cannot replicate." The conversation was interrupted by urgent alerts. The devourers had accelerated again, reaching the fourth system in just 3 days. But this time, the Council forces had implemented some of the human recommendations. Instead of logical defensive positions, ships had been placed according to what Park called paranoid scenarios. The result was remarkable. The devourers' initial attack patterns failed to achieve their usual rapid victory. They seemed confused by defensive positions that made no tactical sense, but that covered unlikely attack vectors that a logical enemy wouldn't consider. "It's working," Park said, watching the battle displays with intense concentration. "They're adapting, but it's taking them longer." HFY observed the battle with his new fear-enhanced perception. The human recommendations had bought time, But he could see that the Devourers were beginning to understand even the human irrationality. His fear told him that this was only a temporary advantage. "Admiral Lee," he said, "my fear indicates that the Devourers will adapt to our fear-based tactics as well. We need additional contingency strategies." "Already working on it?" Lee replied. "We're implementing what we call cascade paranoia tactics. Every time they adapt to our irrationality, we become irrationally afraid of their adaptation and change our irrationality." This statement should have been incomprehensible to Zexhai's logical mind. Instead, his fear made it seem like the most sensible strategy he had ever heard. "I wish to contribute to these cascade paranoia tactics," Zexhai said. "My logical training, combined with fear-based analysis, may produce useful hybrid approaches." "Welcome to the human way of warfare," Park said, with a grim smile, "where being terrified is a tactical advantage." Over the next several hours, Zexhai worked with the human tactical team to develop what they called impossible contingency matrices. These were battle plans designed around scenarios that were too unlikely for logical consideration but too terrible for fear to ignore. As they worked, other alien species began requesting inclusion in the planning process. The crystallines wanted to contribute their harmonic analysis capabilities to fear-based pattern recognition. The Zilithians offered their rapid communication abilities for coordinating irrational tactical changes. "This is unprecedented," Dr. Vex Thor chimed. But now, his harmonic patterns included what Zexhai recognized as the crystalline equivalent of fearful excitement. Multi-species tactical coordination based on emotional rather than logical frameworks. The real test came when the Devourers finished with the fourth system and moved toward the fifth, where the combined Council human fleet was waiting in their terrifyingly illogical formation. The battle began with the Devourers' usual adaptive assault, but this time they encountered tactics that changed faster than they could analyze. Human ships made decisions based on fear-driven intuition. Vorthok vessels implemented logical impossibilities, suggested by fear-enhanced analysis. Crystalline formations shifted according to harmonic terror, rather than mathematical optimization. "They're confused," Park announced, watching the Devourer response patterns. "Their adaptation cycles are slowing down." Zexhai felt a surge of something he had never experienced before. Not just fear, but fear transformed into fierce determination. They are encountering tactical frameworks outside their programming parameters. "Admiral Lee," he transmitted to the human fleet, "my fear suggests implementing maximum paranoia protocols. Assume they will adapt to our current success and prepare counter-adaptation strategies immediately." "Already on it," Lee replied. "We're switching to nightmare scenario tactics in 3 minutes." Zexhai didn't ask what nightmare scenario tactics were. His fear told him he didn't want to know until he had to know. The battle continued for 18 hours. Longer than any previous engagement with the Devourers. The combined fleet lost ships, but they also destroyed 2 of the massive mechanical constructs. For the first time since the crisis began, the Devourers retreated to reanalyze their approach. As the immediate danger passed, Zexhai found himself looking at Park with new understanding. The human had been living with this terrible, wonderful, powerful emotion his entire life. Fear had made him constantly prepared for disasters that might never come. But when an impossible disaster did come, he was ready for it. "Captain Park," Zexhai said, "I believe I understand now why fear exists." Park looked at him with tired but hopeful eyes. "What do you understand?" "Fear is not weakness," Zexhai said. "Fear is preparation for possibilities that logic cannot calculate. Fear is the gift that allows survival in impossible circumstances. And now you have that gift too," Park said. Zexhai looked out at the stars, still afraid but no longer ashamed of his fear. Tomorrow, the Devourers would return with new adaptations, and the galaxy would need even more impossible strategies to survive. But for the first time since the crisis began, he believed they might actually have a chance. Because now, they had fear on their side. 6 months after the last devourer was destroyed, HFY stood before the Vorthok High Council on his home world. The chamber was filled with the greatest logical minds of his species, their elongated faces showing the careful neutrality that marked superior Vorthak intellect. He could feel their disapproval radiating toward him like cold radiation. "Researcher HFY," spoke Vorth Prime Kexdal, the highest-ranking member of the council. "Your reports describe emotional contamination that has allegedly enhanced your analytical capabilities. This contradicts fundamental principles of Vorthok evolution." And HFY felt the familiar sensation of fear rising in his consciousness. Not the overwhelming terror he had experienced during the Devourer crisis, but a steady, informative fear that told him his own people now saw him as dangerous. 6 months ago, this would have paralyzed him with shame. Now, it simply provided useful data about the challenge he faced. "Honored Prime," he replied, "I request permission to demonstrate the practical applications of fear-enhanced analysis." The council members exchanged glances. Dr. Yexmore, the chief of biological sciences, spoke with clear distaste. "Emotional contamination is not a subject for demonstration. It is a contamination to be corrected. Before correction is considered," HFY said, activating a holographic display, "please observe these tactical analysis comparisons." The display showed 2 sets of strategic plans. The first were the original council responses to the Devourer threat, based on pure, logical analysis. The second were the fear-enhanced strategies that had ultimately succeeded. "The logical approaches failed consistently," HFY explained. "The fear-enhanced approaches succeeded. Fear provided access to analytical frameworks that logic alone could not reach." Vorth Prime Kexdal studied the data with visible skepticism. These results could be explained by random chance and unknown variables. Emotion is not a valid analytical tool. HFY had expected this response. He activated a second display, showing current galactic threats that the Council was analyzing purely through logic. "Honored Prime, our logical analysis suggests that the Xerion Empire poses no immediate threat to our territory because their expansion patterns follow predictable resource optimization. However, my fear-enhanced analysis suggests we should prepare for scenarios where they abandon optimization in favor of strategic irrationality." "Preposterous," Dr. Yexmore stated. "Advanced civilizations do not abandon optimization. The Devourers were an advanced civilization," HFY replied quietly. "Their logical optimization made them predictable. The humans defeated them by abandoning optimization in favor of controlled irrationality guided by fear." This statement caused a stir among the council members. The idea that abandoning logic could be superior to logic was deeply disturbing to Vorthak philosophy. Before the council could respond, an urgent communication signal interrupted the session. The message was from Captain Park, transmitting from the observation station where HFY had first learned about fear. "HFY," Park's voice filled the chamber. "We need your help. The Xerion Empire has just launched attacks on 3 systems simultaneously, using tactics that make no logical sense. Our military analysts are completely confused, but their irrationality is proving devastatingly effective." The silence in the council chamber was profound. HFY felt his fear shift into a familiar pattern of desperate determination. "Honored Prime," he said, "I request permission to return to the Galactic Crisis Response Team. My fear-enhanced analytical capabilities may be required to address this new threat." Vorth Prime Kexdal stared at the communication display for a long moment. "The Xerion Empire has maintained logical expansion patterns for 300 years. Their sudden adoption of irrational tactics represents a significant analytical challenge. A challenge that pure logic may be insufficient to address," HFY said. "Fear allows analysis of irrational possibilities that logical frameworks cannot process." Dr. Yexmore spoke with clear reluctance. "If emotional contamination has indeed provided analytical capabilities that pure logic lacks, then perhaps limited experimentation might be justified. HFY felt a surge of hope mixed with his persistent fear. I propose the establishment of a joint research initiative. Vorthak logical analysis combined with human fear-based strategic thinking. The best of both approaches. You would teach other Vorthak to experience fear? Vorth Prime Kexdal asked. I would teach them to recognize that fear provides information that logic cannot access. HFY replied. I would teach them that emotional intelligence is not weakness, but an additional tool for understanding reality. The council deliberated in the rapid subvocal communications that characterized high-level Vorthak decision-making. Finally, Vorth Prime Kexdal spoke. Researcher HFY, you will establish this joint research initiative. However, you will be monitored for further emotional contamination, and the program will be terminated if it proves harmful to Vorthak logical integrity. Understood, Honored Prime. 3 days later, HFY found himself back on the observation station, working with Park and a small group of volunteer Vorthak researchers who had agreed to learn about fear. The process was difficult and disturbing for his fellow Vorthak, but the results were immediately apparent. This sensation is highly unpleasant, said Dr. Texven, one of the volunteer researchers, as he experienced his first fear response while analyzing Xerion battle tactics. But it is providing analytical data that my logical processes did not generate. Onophirology, AMP. Park smiled as he watched the Vorthak scientists struggling with their new emotional awareness. Fear is never pleasant, but it keeps you alive. HFY observed his colleagues with a mixture of pride and concern. They were taking the same difficult journey he had taken, learning to embrace an emotion they had been trained to consider primitive and useless. Dr. Texven, he said, what does your fear tell you about the Xerion tactical patterns? Texven paused, clearly struggling to translate fear-based insights into language. My fear suggests that their irrationality is not random. It suggests that they learned from observing our victory over the Devourers. They are using deliberate irrationality as a weapon against logical opponents. Exactly, Park said. And now we need to develop fear-based countermeasures against weaponized irrationality. As the days passed, the joint research team developed new strategic frameworks that combined Vorthak analytical precision with human emotional intelligence. The results exceeded everyone's expectations, creating tactical approaches that neither species could have developed alone. The Xerion threat was neutralized within 6 weeks. Their weaponized irrationality countered by an even more sophisticated combination of logic and fear-driven intuition. But more importantly, the galaxy had changed. Species that had previously dismissed emotion as primitive began requesting human consultation on their own fear responses. The crystallines developed harmonic fear analysis. The Zilithians learned to use rapid communication bursts, driven by emotional urgency. HFY stood in his old position by the observation deck window, looking down at Earth. But now Park stood beside him, and they were joined by representatives from a dozen species, all learning to integrate emotion and logic in new ways. Do you ever regret learning to fear? Park asked. HFY considered the question carefully. Fear had made his life more complicated, more difficult, more uncertain, but it had also made him more capable, more prepared, more alive. No, he said finally. Fear taught me that logic alone is insufficient for survival. Fear taught me that emotions provide information that pure reasoning cannot access. Fear taught me that admitting weakness can lead to strength. Park nodded. Fear taught you to be human. No, HFY replied, watching the earth turn slowly below them. Fear taught me to be more than Vorthok, just as it taught you to be more than the sum of your fears. Fear is not a human trait. Fear is a tool for survival that any intelligence can learn to use. In the months that followed, the galaxy became a different place, not more fearful, but more aware, more prepared for impossible threats. more ready for challenges that logic alone could not solve. And in the observation station that orbited Earth, beings from across the galaxy came to learn about an emotion they had once considered weakness, but that had proven to be one of the most powerful analytical tools in the universe. Fear had become the bridge between species, the common ground that allowed different forms of intelligence to work together against threats that no single approach could handle alone. Only beside humanity had HFY learned what fear truly was. But in teaching others, he had discovered that fear was not uniquely human. It was universally valuable.